The boardroom was suffocating with panic. Screens glowed red with crashing numbers, and a dozen executives shouted over one another like trapped animals. The company's lifeline was breaking apart. Orders were backed up, warehouses frozen, delivery, trucks idle. Every minute cost millions. The future of the corporation trembled on the edge of collapse. In the middle of this chaos, the door opened quietly. A man in a gray uniform stepped in with a stack of envelopes. His shoes squeaked softly against the polished floor. Nobody turned their head. He might as well have been a shadow. David, the mailroom clerk, walked around the edge of the long table, placing letters beside trembling hands and glowing tablets. Not one executive looked him in the eye. Their voices roared past him, debating contracts, blaming suppliers, tearing each other apart with words sharp enough to cut. He had delivered mail here for years, invisible furniture in a world of suits and silk ties. But what none of them knew was that David already had the answer. He had watched this company's veins and arteries every day. The flow of shipments, the routes of trucks, the heartbeat of warehouses. While executives traveled in jets and drank champagne, David had been studying, recording, filling notebooks late into the night. He knew the system better than anyone, in that room. And as he listened to their empty noise, one truth echoed in his chest. They had no idea what they were doing. He paused at the door. Behind him, the shouting built like thunder. His jaw tightened. His hand curled into a fist at his side. They did not see him. They did not hear him. But soon they would, because when the system broke beyond repair, when all their power collapsed into silence, David's plan would be the only thing left standing. And on that day, the mailroom clerk they had ignored would leave them speechless. David's mornings began before the sun. He would wake in a cramped apartment where the hum of the refrigerator was louder than the silence. The paint peeled on the ceiling, and the neighbors argued through thin walls. He pressed his shirt carefully, polished his shoes until they shined, and carried himself with quiet dignity, even though he knew the world barely noticed him. On the subway ride downtown, he often studied a small black notebook filled with diagrams and numbers, routes, schedules, bottlenecks, and costs. It looked like scribbles to others, but to David it was a map of the company's lifeblood. Each page was proof that he saw patterns the executives ignored. He guarded this notebook like treasure. At the office tower, security guards nodded at him with casual indifference. He passed through gleaming marble lobbies into the back hallways where mail carts rattled, and workers in uniforms carried the weight of the corporation's daily pulse. He liked the rhythm of it, delivering, sorting, observing, always watching. Executives never remembered his name. Some called him Mail Guy. Others did not call him anything at all. They carried themselves as though he were furniture that spoke only when asked. Once, an executive dropped an envelope on the floor at David's feet and kept walking. David picked it up in silence. But David had grown used to invisibility. It was not new. At school, teachers underestimated him. On jobs, supervisors dismissed him. He had learned the bitter lesson that people looked at his skin and his uniform before they looked at his mind. What they never understood was that invisibility could also be freedom. No one guarded their words when he entered a room. No one lowered their screens. He saw contracts, delivery schedules, urgent memos. He heard fragments of calls. Piece by piece, he gathered the hidden story of the company's operations. In the mailroom, while sorting stacks, David thought about the machinery that kept the company alive. The movement of goods from port to warehouse, from warehouse to truck, from truck to customer. He understood the weak joints, the fragile timing, the wasted costs. He sketched solutions in his notebook. He dreamed of faster routes, cleaner systems, smarter ways. Every day he carried mail upstairs to the executive floors, the carpets thick under his shoes, the glass walls shining. He watched them laugh in meetings, order lunch delivered, dismiss problems with a wave of the hand. He thought of the warehouse, workers sweating in the cold, the drivers stuck in endless traffic, the clerks buried under spreadsheets. He saw the divide clearer than anyone. There were moments of small cruelty that cut deeper than insults. One afternoon, he overheard two executives joking near the elevator. One said, If we had to depend on the mailroom boys to fix logistics, we'd be out of business in a week. They laughed as if it were truth. David kept walking, face steady, though inside he burned. What none of them knew was that he had already calculated a system that could save them millions. He had tested it in theory, run the numbers, refined the flow. He believed in it as much as he believed in his own heartbeat. Yet he also knew the cruel truth. No one would listen. Not until everything broke. So he waited, patient as stone, watching the cracks spread wider every month. The warning signs appeared like cracks in glass. Small at first, easy to ignore, but spreading with every week. David saw them before anyone else. A late shipment here, a misrouted truck there, warehouses reporting missing pallets, paperwork lagging, behind reality. The executives glanced at reports filled with smooth numbers, but David handled the raw documents. He touched the paper that revealed delays, the handwritten notes from desperate warehouse clerks, the invoices that never matched. He felt the pulse of the company skipping beats. One morning in the mailroom, he unfolded a packet addressed to operations. The report was filled with red flags, backlogs stacking up, shipments sitting idle for days. David tapped his pen against the page. This was not a hiccup. This was a storm brewing. At lunch, he sat with a few co-workers from maintenance and deliveries. They laughed about sports, shook their heads about traffic. But when David mentioned the delays he had noticed, they shrugged. "We've been telling them for months," one driver said. "Nobody listens, they think we're exaggerating." Another clerk added, "As long as the executives get their bonuses, they don't care. They'll let us drown first." David listened, nodding. He didn't argue, but inside he felt the urgency like a ticking clock. At night in his apartment, he spread papers across the table. His notebook grew heavier with sketches and arrows, boxes and lines mapping supply chains. He circled weak points. He calculated costs piling like bricks. He imagined executives ignoring the storm until it broke down the doors. Weeks passed. The cracks widened. David carried mail to conference rooms where executives sipped coffee, staring at screens filled with misleading optimism. He delivered envelopes while overhearing fragments of meetings. A vice president barked about tightening the belt. Another dismissed a warehouse complaint as low-level noise. He wanted to shout, "You're blind. The system is breaking." But he kept walking, head down, uniform neat. One afternoon, while dropping off documents, David caught sight of a memo left on the corner of a desk. His eyes scanned it quickly, projected shipping delays across 3 states. He had predicted 2 months ago in his notebook. He wanted to laugh, but it was not funny. It was terrifying. By now, the warehouse workers whispered about chaos. Trucks waited in endless lines to unload. Drivers were furious. Clients called nonstop. The frontline workers saw the flood, but the executives still believed in calm seas. David felt like a man standing on a pier, watching a storm gather on the horizon while the rich sipped wine behind him. He knew when the storm struck, it would tear everything apart. And he knew, with sharp clarity, that the only way out was the plan inside his notebook. He kept waiting, waiting for the day when their arrogance would collapse into desperation. And that day was coming fast. The storm arrived with brutal force. It began with a wave of furious phone calls from clients. Orders were late by days, products spoiled in warehouses, trucks sat idle in parking lots with no clear instructions. The system buckled. The news spread. Quickly. Headlines shouted about failures at one of the largest logistics companies in the country. Stock prices fell overnight. Investors demanded answers. Executives scrambled like ants under fire. David felt it everywhere. The mailroom buzzed with rumors, workers moving faster than usual, voices sharp with worry. He overheard secretaries whispering about emergency meetings upstairs. He saw memos stamped urgent in thick red ink. On his route, he witnessed the collapse up close. A manager paced outside his office, shouting into a phone, "I don't care what it takes, just move." Those shipments. Another slammed his fist against a desk, cursing about losses. David remained invisible as always, delivering envelopes while the powerful lost their composure. But inside, he carried a storm of his own. He wanted to say, "I warned myself this would happen. I wrote it down months ago." Instead, he listened, watched, waited. By the second week, the crisis reached fever pitch. Warehouses overflowed, clients threatened lawsuits, news cameras circled like vultures. The executives scheduled a massive emergency meeting, pulling every high-ranking official into the top-floor boardroom. The doors were closed to outsiders. David was not invited. Of course he wasn't. He was the mailroom clerk. Still, he was summoned to deliver a stack of documents into that very room. He entered quietly, the weight of papers in his hands, and stepped into the storm. The boardroom was chaos. Suits shouting across the long table, red-faced, veins bulging. Screens on the wall showed graphs plunging into darkness. Words like catastrophe and meltdown echoed. Nobody noticed David slip around the table, placing envelopes beside trembling hands. "Blame the suppliers," one executive shouted. "No, it's transportation," another snapped. "You approved the budget cuts," someone else accused. The arguments were venomous, childish, desperate. David moved silently among them, eyes calm. Though his heart pounded, he wanted to scream, "None of you understand the system. You're all blind." But he swallowed the words. When he placed the last envelope down, he glanced at the screens. The numbers confirmed what he had already written in his notebook. The system was broken beyond quick repair. Every second, money bled from the company like water from a cracked pipe. He lingered for a moment at the edge of the room. The executives did not see him. They never did. He was a ghost in their palace. But in his chest, a decision began to form. For years, he had been patient. For years, he had waited, recording, calculating, building his plan in silence. Now the company teetered on the edge of ruin. The moment he had anticipated had arrived. As he left the boardroom, the shouting still echoing behind him, David knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they continued this way, the company would collapse. And when it did, every worker, every driver, every clerk would pay the price for the arrogance of men in suits. He could not let that happen. The storm had exploded. The city would soon feel the shockwaves. And in the center of it all stood one man in a gray uniform, holding the only map out of disaster. The executives sealed themselves inside the boardroom for hours. The doors stayed locked, the blinds drawn. From the mailroom floor below, David could hear the muffled rhythm of voices rising and falling like waves crashing against rocks. The company was drowning, and the captains were too busy shouting at each other to grab the wheel. At noon, a secretary rushed downstairs with an urgent order. "Delivery to the boardroom. They need these files immediately." She dropped a stack of binders into David's arms without even looking at him. When he stepped into the room, the air felt thick. The long polished table was littered with papers, laptops, empty coffee cups. The smell of stress hung heavy. Executives leaned forward, faces red, fingers stabbing at charts on glowing screens. David set the binders down one by one, silent as always. He moved slowly, eyes flicking across the papers in front of them. He saw contracts, shipping schedules, emergency memos. Words and numbers swam before him, but to him they were not chaos. They were proof. Proof of everything he had written in his notebook. A vice president slammed his fist on the table. "We're bleeding out millions every day. If this doesn't stop, we'll face bankruptcy by next quarter." Another snapped back. "Your department cut costs in transportation. What did you expect?" "That was your recommendation." The room erupted. David slid the final binder into place, but his feet refused to move toward the door. He lingered, pretending to adjust the mailbag on his shoulder, while his ears absorbed every word. "They want solutions," one executive barked, "but all I see are excuses. Maybe we bring in outside consultants. Too late. By the time they even understand the system, we'll be gone." Panic disguised itself as arrogance. They pointed fingers, raised voices, barked empty slogans about efficiency and synergy. Yet in all the noise, no one spoke with clarity. No one showed a map forward. David's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to speak, to tell them that the answer was simple, if only they could see the system as a living body instead of a broken machine. But he knew how it would go. They would laugh. They would dismiss him. They would never believe the solution could come from the mailroom. He left quietly, though the noise chased him down the hallway. Outside the boardroom, he stopped, leaning against the wall. He closed his eyes, breathing slow. The arrogance of that room was unbearable. Men and women paid millions to lead were flailing like children, while the solution sat written in his notebook, carried in his head every day. It was cruelty disguised as order. They would let workers suffer, drivers lose pay, families struggle rather than admit they were blind. David opened his eyes with a new clarity. He could not stay silent much longer. If he did, the storm would sink not only the executives but everyone beneath them. The warehouse clerks, the drivers, the men and women who kept the lifeblood of the company flowing. People like him. The closed door meeting had confirmed what he always knew. They were incapable of saving the company. They were incapable of listening. But the day would come when they would have no choice but to hear him. And when that day came, he would be ready. That day arrived sooner than anyone expected. The crisis reached its breaking point in the third week. Customers began pulling contracts. Competitors circled like sharks. The company's name filled the headlines with words like failure and collapse. Executives who once strutted through the building now moved with pale faces and tight jaws. The tension spread downward. Workers whispered in break rooms about layoffs. Truck drivers waited unpaid for hours at clogged warehouses. Clerks feared for their jobs. Fear hung like smoke. David carried mail through these halls, but inside he carried something heavier. The weight of choice. Stay invisible, or risk everything to be heard. One morning he spotted a mid-level manager he had always considered fairer than most. Her name was Ms. Carter. She had spoken to him kindly in the past, once even asked his opinion. About a late delivery, he saw her standing alone in the hallway, phone pressed to her ear, voice low with panic. When she hung up, David stepped forward before fear could stop him. "Ms. Carter," he said quietly. She glanced at him, distracted. "Yes, David?" "I can't talk long. I have something you need to see." Her brow furrowed. "Now really isn't the time. It's about the system, the logistics. I've been tracking it. I know where the breaks are, and I know how to fix them." She blinked, caught between disbelief and exhaustion. "You're the mailroom clerk." "Yes," David answered, his voice steady. "And I've been watching this system every single day for years. I've built a plan. It will work." Silence stretched between them. For a moment she almost walked away, but then something in his eyes made her pause. Desperation forced her to gamble. "Show me," she said. That night after his shift, David laid his notebook open in the break room. Ms. Carter leaned over the pages, her eyes scanning the diagrams, the numbers, the careful logic he had built line by line. "This," she whispered, "this actually makes sense." David nodded. "It doesn't just make sense, it will save the company. But you have to get me into the room. They won't listen otherwise." Ms. Carter looked torn. "They'll laugh at you. They'll say it's impossible." "Let them laugh," David said, his voice rising. "But when they see the proof, they won't have a choice." The next day, Ms. Carter took a risk. She mentioned David's name in a smaller strategy meeting. Executives scoffed. "A mailroom clerk?" One sneered. "We're not running a charity." Desperate times, she countered. "Do you have a better plan?" The laughter was sharp and cruel. "He delivers envelopes, Carter. That's his specialty." But even ridicule could not erase the reality of collapse. Eventually, with no better options on the table, they allowed David into a meeting, if only to silence him. When he entered, the room buzzed with condescension. A dozen eyes turned toward his uniform, his mailbag slung over his shoulder. They saw a servant, not a strategist. "Well, Mr. Mailman," one executive said, smirking, "let's hear your miracle." The room erupted in chuckles. David felt the burn of humiliation, but he stood straight. He placed his notebook on the table, opened it carefully, and began to speak. His voice was calm, precise. I have tracked every shipment for the past year. I have logged every bottleneck, every delay. What you are facing now isn't a surprise. It's the result of neglect. But it can be fixed. Here is how. He turned the notebook toward them, revealing his diagrams. Routes simplified, warehouse flows streamlined, costs slashed. The executives leaned back, unimpressed. We've seen diagrams before. David looked each of them in the eye. Not like these. These come with numbers. Real numbers. He pulled copies of invoices, delivery logs, and schedules from his mailbag. Evidence he had quietly collected. Proof they could not deny. The laughter began to fade. The smirks weakened. One executive cleared his throat. Even if this plan worked, why should we trust it? Because you have no choice, David replied firmly. You've tried your way, you've failed. I've been invisible to you, but I've been watching. I know this system better than anyone here, and if you want to save this company, you will follow this plan. The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter. For the first time, they were not dismissing him. They were listening. The next meeting was no longer small or private. This time, the crisis demanded a full assembly. Executives filled the long boardroom table. Directors patched in through video calls, and assistants stood along the walls with laptops open. The atmosphere was grim. The company was bleeding money by the hour, and the press smelled blood in the water. David stood at the end of the room, his uniform neat, notebook under his arm. He had never felt so visible in his life, and yet so vulnerable. The eyes on him carried doubt, mockery, and a sharp edge of desperation. Let's get this over with, muttered one executive, glancing at his watch. David opened his notebook and placed it on the table. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice came steady. For years I have handled the flow of documents that track your shipments, your invoices, and your schedules. While I delivered your mail, I studied your system. I know every weak point because I touched the evidence every day. And what I see here, he tapped the notebook, is a pattern of waste and neglect that brought you to this crisis. He turned the pages, showing diagrams. Boxes and arrows mapped supply chains across the country. He pointed at choke points, explaining how trucks were routed inefficiently, how warehouses were forced to handle more than they were designed for, how suppliers were mismatched with demand. One executive snorted, "We've paid consultants thousands for similar charts. This is nothing new." David met his eyes. "The difference is that I have the receipts." From his mailbag, he pulled out copies of real delivery logs, handwritten complaints from warehouses, invoices with dates that proved weeks of delays. He spread them across the table like cards in a game, every piece a nail in the coffin of executive denial. This isn't theory. This is your data, ignored, buried, and it proves exactly what I am saying. The room shifted. Some executives leaned forward, curiosity replacing arrogance. Others frowned, uneasy at the weight of evidence. David pressed on. His voice grew stronger with every word. If you reroute shipments using my model, you cut travel time by 30%. If you stagger warehouse intake by my schedule, you eliminate backlog. If you restructure supplier assignments, you save millions in wasted inventory. He pointed at the figures he had calculated. Follow this plan, and within 2 weeks the system begins to breathe again. Within a month, losses stop. Within a quarter, profits rise higher than before. The room fell into a rare silence. No shouting, no jokes. Only the sound of David's words hanging in the air. Finally, one executive leaned back, eyes narrowed. "And you expect us to believe that a mailroom clerk solved a problem that our best-paid consultants could not?" David did not flinch. "No, I expect you to believe the numbers. You've ignored me for years. You've ignored the workers who see this system every day. But numbers don't lie. And right now, numbers are the only truth that can save you." The weight of the evidence pressed down. Screens glowed with collapsing graphs, while on the table, David's papers painted a way out. The arrogance of the room cracked. Ms. Carter spoke softly but firmly. "We don't have a better option. We've tried everything else. Let him lead the fix." The chairman, pale and sweating, rubbed his forehead. He looked around the table, searching for someone to object. No one did. The silence was its own verdict. Finally, he turned to David. "Very well, we'll test your plan, but if it fails..." David cut him off. "It won't fail." The mailroom clerk had spoken like a commander. The meeting ended not with laughter, but with a quiet, stunned acceptance. Executives filed out, murmuring, some still skeptical, some secretly relieved. David gathered his notebook, his chest heaving. He had done it. For the first time, they had listened. Now the real test would begin. The first week of David's plan was chaos. Executives barked orders, managers scrambled, workers resisted changes they didn't yet understand. But as the days passed, a strange shift began. Warehouses that had been drowning in pallets began to breathe. Trucks that once idled for hours now moved steadily in and out. Routes that bled time and fuel suddenly ran smoother. David worked side by side with managers, explaining the flow, showing them the maps, walking through the changes step by step. At first they looked at him with disbelief. But as the numbers began to rise, as the backlog began to shrink, disbelief turned to respect. By the second week, the company felt different. Call centers reported fewer complaints. Drivers returned with shorter shifts. The news began to notice. Headlines shifted from collapse to recovery. Executives who once mocked David now watched him with wary eyes. They spoke his name with reluctant respect. Some tried to claim credit, but the truth was undeniable. Everyone in the company knew who had brought the system back from the brink. Word spread quickly among the workers. In break rooms and loading docks, they spoke of the mailroom clerk who saved the company. By the end of the month, profits stabilized. Losses shrank. For the first time in months, hope returned. And then came the meeting that changed everything. David was summoned once again to the boardroom, this time not as a servant, but as a guest. He entered with no mailbag, only his notebook. The executive sat stiffly, no laughter, no smirks. The chairman cleared his throat. "David, against all odds, your plan worked. The company owes you more than we can express." David stood silently for a moment, looking around the room. The same faces that once ignored him now stared at him with something close to awe. He thought of the years of invisibility, the insults, the casual cruelty. "You don't owe me thanks," he said finally. "You owe it to every worker you ignored, the people in warehouses, on the roads, in the mailrooms. You failed them. And if you want this company to survive, you will start listening." The words struck like a hammer. The room was silent. For once, they could not deny him. In that silence, David knew justice had come. Not perfect justice, not enough to erase years of invisibility, but justice nonetheless. He had forced them to see him. He had forced them to see the truth. The mailroom clerk had saved the company, and the executives would never forget it. The recovery was not a miracle. It was math. 3 months after David's plan had been set in motion, the numbers told the story louder than any speech. Delivery delays, once averaging 8 days, fell to less than 24 hours. Warehouse backlogs, once overflowing with unsent shipments, dropped by 70%. Truck idle time was cut in half, saving millions in fuel and labor costs. The financial reports confirmed it. Losses that had spiraled into the tens of millions flattened, then reversed. By the second quarter, the company posted its first profit since the crisis began. Shareholders breathed easier. News outlets, once circling for the company's death, now reported on its remarkable turnaround. Executives gave statements filled with hollow phrases about resilience and teamwork. But inside the walls of the company, everyone knew the truth. The turnaround had one architect, and his name was David. For David, the numbers carried a deeper weight than profits. Each percentage point of improvement meant drivers spent less time stranded on highways. Each reduced backlog meant warehouse workers could finally breathe instead of drowning in chaos. Each dollar saved meant jobs protected, families secure, He had turned private calculations, once scribbled in a notebook in a small apartment, into living proof that the overlooked could hold power. David still rode the same subway each morning. He still polished his shoes, pressed his shirt, carried himself with quiet dignity. But now, when he entered the building, people saw him. Security guards nodded with respect. Clerks stopped to shake his hand. Warehouse managers called him the man who saved us. The executives never forgot their humiliation. Some avoided his eyes, others forced polite smiles. But even their silence was acknowledgement. David had forced them to hear the voice they once ignored. In his apartment at night, David opened his notebook again. The same black cover, the same careful handwriting. Only now, the pages carried not just warnings and diagrams, but results. Real numbers, concrete proof. He wrote them down like history. Delivery times cut by 70%. Idle truck hours reduced by half. Quarterly profit, $15.2 million. He underlined the figures, letting the ink sink deep into the paper. They were not just statistics, they were testimony. The testimony of an invisible man who refused to stay invisible. And when David closed the notebook, he allowed himself a rare smile, because numbers could be erased. Statements could be twisted. Executives could take credit. But the workers knew the truth. The story was already spreading. The story of how a mailroom clerk saved a corporation when the elite lost control. And no one could take that away. This story proves one thing. The voices we ignore often hold the answers we need most. David was overlooked, dismissed, even laughed at. But in the end, he turned the tables with nothing but truth, evidence, and courage. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever carried ideas that others refuse to hear, this story is for you. Share it with someone who needs that reminder. Comment below with your own story of being overlooked and fighting back. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that reveal the power of the unseen.